The moment Annie Morgan stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1874, every man on the dusty main street stopped what he was doing and stared, and not a single one of them was going to be the reason she stayed. She had come a long way from Missouri, carrying nothing more than a battered leather trunk, a photograph of a man she had never met, and a letter promising her a new life on the frontier. The letter had been written by a man named Gerald Fitch, a cattle rancher who had placed an advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper seeking a bride with a strong constitution and a willingness to work. Annie had answered that advertisement not out of desperation, exactly, but out of a bone-deep need to be somewhere that was not behind the counter of her late father's general store, slowly suffocating under the weight of debts she had not made and a life she had not chosen. Redemption Creek smelled of horse and sawdust, and something faintly sweet she could not identify. The buildings along the main street were sun-bleached and raw, like bones left out in the heat. A wooden sign above the largest building read Harmon's Saloon, and a smaller hand-painted sign below it read Ladies Welcome if they behave. Annie looked at that sign for a moment and almost smiled. A man came striding toward her from the direction of the livery stable, and she recognized him from the photograph as Gerald Fitch. He was older than the photograph suggested, thick through the middle, with sun-cracked skin and eyes that moved over her the way a buyer looks at a horse at auction. He took her hand without asking and shook it once hard. "You are smaller than I expected," he said, "but you look healthy enough. Good teeth," Annie blinked. "I beg your pardon, your teeth. Let me see them." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the man had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "Mr. Fitch," she said, her voice even and clear, "I have traveled 8 days on a coach with a broken spring and a traveling salesman who snored loud enough to rattle the windows. I am tired, I am dusty, and I am hungry. You will show me where I will be staying tonight, and tomorrow morning we will discuss arrangements, but you will not look at my teeth today." Someone behind her laughed. She turned and saw a man leaning against the post of the general store, arms crossed, hat pushed back on his head, grinning at the exchange. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same hard red stone as the canyon surrounding the town. He wore a dusty trail coat and spurs that caught the afternoon light, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, something between admiration and amusement. He tipped his hat when he caught her looking. She turned back to Gerald Fitch. "The boarding house," she said. "Now, if you please." She had been in Redemption Creek for exactly 4 days when she realized that Gerald Fitch was not a man she could marry. It was not one single thing, but an accumulation of small cruelties. The way he spoke to his ranch hands as though they were mules. The way he dismissed everything she said with a small wave of his hand. The way he had told her on her second evening that she would be expected to give up her habit of reading because books made women uppity. On the morning of the 5th day, she went to find him at his ranch to return the small gold ring he had pressed into her hand the previous afternoon, and to tell him as clearly as she could that she would not be marrying him. She had no plan beyond that. She had $11.40, a trunk full of practical dresses, and a country she did not know. But she had stood in her dead father's store for 6 years watching other people live their lives, and she had made herself a promise that she would never do that again. The walk out to Fitch's ranch was 3 miles along a red dirt road that wound through scrub brush and past a dry creek bed. She had been walking for about half an hour when a horse came up behind her at a trot and slowed to match her pace. She looked up and saw the man from the general store, the one who had laughed the day she arrived. "Morning," he said. "That is a long walk on a hot day." "I have noticed," she said, and kept walking. "You heading to Fitch's ranch? That is my business." "Sure is," he agreed pleasantly. He made no move to ride ahead or to leave. "Wallace Dawson," he said after a moment. "I run a cattle operation about 4 miles north of here. We have a well if you need water." She glanced up at him. He was even better looking in the clear morning light than he had appeared in the shade of the general store porch. There was a directness in his eyes, a dark brown that caught the sun like polished wood, and none of the slick calculation she had seen in Gerald Fitch's gaze. She noticed his hands on the reins were careful and steady. "Annie Morgan," she said. "I know, word travels fast in a small town." He pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and offered it down to her. "You walked past the only shade between here and the Fitch property. I suggest you drink something." She took the canteen. The water was cool and she drank more of it than she intended to. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. "Are you in some kind of trouble, Miss Morgan?" "No," she said. "I am in the process of getting out of some trouble." He nodded as though that made all the sense in the world. "Well then, you need a ride, or do you prefer the walking?" She thought about it. She was already hot and the dust was working its way into her shoes. "A ride would be acceptable," she said, "to the edge of the Fitch property." He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion and boosted her up with the kind of matter-of-fact competence that suggested he had done that sort of thing many times without attaching any significance to it. She settled herself sideways across the saddle, and he swung up behind her, keeping a careful and proper distance, one hand on the reins and his eyes forward. "Can I ask what kind of trouble?" he said after they had ridden in silence for a few minutes. "The mail order bride kind." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a hard sort," he said. "He asked to examine my teeth," she said. "The way you assess livestock." "That sounds like Fitch. You know him." Everybody knows everybody in a town of 300 people. There was something careful in his voice, something held back. She turned her head to look at him and found him watching the road ahead with studied attention. "You do not like him," she said. "I do not know him well enough to dislike him," Wallace said, which she suspected was not entirely true but was polite. "I know he has gone through 2 ranch foremen in the past year, and that his horses are thin in spring when they should be fat." That told her enough. Gerald Fitch was not pleased to see her arrive on another man's horse. He stood in the yard of his ranch house, which was large and sun-baked and not particularly welcoming, and his face went through several rapid changes of expression when he saw her. Wallace Dawson remained on the horse while she slid down and walked across the dust to where Fitch stood. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "I have given this considerable thought, and I have decided that I am not able to marry you. I am returning your ring, and I want to thank you for the cost of my passage, which I will repay you in full as soon as I am able." Fitch's face had settled into something cold and flat. "You cannot do that," he said. "We had an agreement. We had a correspondence," she said. "That is not the same thing, and you misrepresented yourself considerably in that correspondence. You do not get to come out here and decide, Mr. Fitch." Wallace Dawson's voice came from behind her, quiet but with an edge in it like a knife laid flat. "The lady has said what she came to say. I suggest you hear it." Fitch looked at him with a calculating fury. He was not a stupid man, whatever else he was, and he understood from the way Wallace sat on that horse that pushing further would not go well for him. He took the ring she held out. He said nothing else, but the look he gave her as she turned away was the kind she felt on the back of her neck for the rest of the morning. On the ride back to town, Wallace said nothing for a long while. The landscape moved around them, the red earth and the blue sky and the distant purple line of the hills, and Annie found herself breathing more freely than she had in days. "I need to find work," she said eventually. "What can you do?" "I can run a store, keep accounts, cook adequately, sew well, read and write, and I have a reasonable knowledge of medicinal plants from an almanac my father kept." He considered this. "Doc Harrell has been looking for someone to help with his accounts. He is not good with numbers and he is too proud to admit it to most people." "How do you know that?" "Because he asked me twice to help him, and I am worse with numbers than he is." The corner of his mouth moved. It was almost a smile. "I can introduce you if you like." She looked at him. "You barely know me." "I know you handed a man back his ring rather than marry him for security," he said. "Out here, that tells you most of what you need to know about a person." She had not expected that. She looked away at the landscape and felt something shift inside her, quiet and significant, the way the ground settles after rain. Dr. Cyrus Harrell was a thin, white-haired man of about 60 who smelled of camphor and kept his medical records in a system that appeared to be organized by color of paper rather than any identifiable logic. He looked at Annie over the top of his spectacles when Wallace brought her in and said, "Can you find the Beaumont account from last November? I have been looking for 3 days." It took her 4 minutes. He hired her on the spot. She moved out of the boarding house at the end of the first week, having negotiated with Doc Harrell for a small room at the back of his surgery in exchange for a reduction in her wages, which were already modest. The room was barely large enough for a bed and a small table, but it had a window that faced east and caught the morning sun, and it was hers. She saw Wallace Dawson in town 2 or 3 times a week. He came in for supplies, for the occasional drink at Harmon's saloon, for the Sunday sermon that Pastor Whitfield delivered with more enthusiasm than accuracy in the small white church at the north end of Main Street. Each time they encountered one another, there was a moment of recognition, a warmth that she found herself looking forward to, and then immediately telling herself not to look forward to. He brought her apples from the tree on his property the second week, leaving them wrapped in his bandana on the step outside the surgery without any note. She knew they were from him because nobody else in Redemption Creek had apple trees, and because they were the best apples she had ever eaten. The third week he came to the surgery not for Doc Harrell but for her, appearing in the doorway of the front room with his hat in his hands and a carefully assembled expression of nonchalance that she found completely transparent. "There is a social at the church on Saturday," he said. "Dancing and such. I was thinking of going and thought you might want company on the walk over, if you are going." "Which I do not know if you are." Annie set down her pen. She looked at him standing in the doorway, tall and sun-browned and so obviously nervous that it made something in her chest do a small, complicated thing. "What time?" she said. He blinked. 7 o'clock. "I will be ready at 7. He nodded, put his hat back on, and left. She heard his horse outside, and then the sound of hooves going down the street at a somewhat faster pace than necessary, and she bent her head over her work so that Doc Harrell, who had appeared in the inner doorway with entirely too interested an expression, could not see her face. The social at Pastor Whitfield's church was exactly what it was intended to be. A gathering of most of the 300 people in and around Redemption Creek, crowded into a whitewashed room with oil lamps, and a fiddle player named Old Clem Barrow, who had 3 fingers missing from his right hand but played beautifully nonetheless. There were trestle tables with pie and cornbread, and the married women of the town had arranged themselves along the west wall, with the specific and practiced alertness of people who intend to observe everything. Wallace Dawson arrived at exactly 7 o'clock and knocked on the door of the surgery with what she was fairly certain was a clean shirt and combed hair. She had put on her second-best dress, the deep blue one with the cream collar that she had made herself the previous winter and which she privately thought was the best thing she owned. He looked at her for a moment when she opened the door and then looked down at his hat and said, "You look very fine, Miss Morgan." "Thank you," she said. "So do you." They walked the 4 blocks to the church side by side, not quite touching, the evening air warm and smelling of dust and wild grass. He told her about his property, 400 acres he had bought 3 years ago with money he had saved over 7 years of working other men's cattle drives, from the Rio Grande north to Abilene and back again. He had built the ranch house himself with 2 men he had met on a drive, good men who now worked for him. He had 30 head of cattle and was working toward 100. She told him about Missouri, about her father's store, about the years after her father died when she had kept the store running and paid off his debts one careful dollar at a time, and about the morning she had read the advertisement in the newspaper and felt something rise in her that she could only describe as a door opening. "Do you regret it?" he said. "Coming out here?" She thought about Gerald Fitch and his cold eyes and the ring she had handed back. She thought about the tiny room with the east-facing window and the apple tree she had not yet seen. She thought about the red earth and the big sky, and the way the world felt larger here than it ever had in Missouri. "Not for a single minute," she said. At the social, she danced with 3 different men before Wallace asked her, which she suspected was a calculation on his part, some code of the frontier that she did not yet fully understand. When he finally held out his hand, she took it without hesitation and they moved onto the floor together, and she discovered that Wallace Dawson danced the way he did most things, with quiet competence and an unhurried attention that made her feel as though she was the only person in the room. "You are very good at this," she said, surprised. "My mother was a good dancer," he said. "She made me learn. I was 12 and I thought it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me." She laughed, and he looked at her when she laughed the way a man looks at something unexpected and beautiful, briefly, as though he does not want to be caught looking. They walked back through the warm dark, and he said good night at the door of the surgery with the same careful propriety he had shown all evening, and she went inside and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while, feeling a quiet riot in her chest that she had no good name for yet. Over the weeks that followed, the rhythm of their acquaintance settled into something easy and sustaining. He came to town on Tuesdays and Fridays, and on those days there was almost always some occasion for conversation. A meal at the small eating house that Mrs. Caldwell ran from her front parlor, or an evening on the porch of the surgery, watching the light fade over the western hills, while Doc Harrell pretended not to watch them from the window. Wallace brought her things from his property without ceremony: early tomatoes, a jar of honey from a hive he had found in a hollow oak, once a small book of poems he had acquired from a passing trader and thought she might like. She always thanked him plainly and directly, the way she did everything, and he always received her thanks with the same quiet simplicity. She learned things about him gradually, the way you learn a landscape, by moving through it over time. He had grown up in Georgia, the son of a farmer who had lost everything in the war. He had come west at 17 with nothing, and had made himself through patience and hard labor and an absolute refusal to cut corners. He was fair to his hands and exacting with himself. He had a younger sister in San Antonio whom he visited twice a year and wrote to every 2 weeks. He read more than most people expected him to. He had a temper that was slow to ignite but fierce when it did, and he had learned, he told her once, to remove himself from situations before it got there, a piece of self-knowledge she found more impressive than most people's virtues. She told him things in return, about the loneliness of running a store alone, of the particular silence of an empty house after her father died, of the books she had read and the world they had opened in her imagination while her body was stuck behind a counter in Missouri. She told him about her mother, who had died when Annie was 8, and who had been, by all accounts, a woman of considerable stubborn spirit that Annie suspected she had inherited. "You are a lot like her," he said. "I hope so," Annie said. He looked at her for a moment with that particular expression she was coming to recognize, the one that seemed to mean more than whatever simple words followed it. "I think you probably are," he said. She was no fool. She knew what was building between them. She could feel it in the particular quality of his attention, in the way the air between them seemed charged with something she had no practical word for, in the way she woke on Tuesday and Friday mornings with a quickened pulse that she could not entirely attribute to the strong coffee Doc Harrell made. But she had come to Redemption Creek having made one bad misjudgment about a man, and she was not inclined to make another. She watched Wallace Dawson carefully and patiently, not testing him exactly, but learning him, the way you learn the depth of a river before you decide to cross. She saw him angry once, when a man from out of town mistreated his horse at the livery stable. She saw him gentle, when Doc Harrell's cat produced a litter of kittens under the surgery steps, and he spent 20 minutes making sure they were safe and warm before he went into his business. She saw him honest to the point of embarrassment, when the merchant at the general store gave him too much change, and he counted it out and gave it back down to the last penny. She saw him kind in the way that costs something. When old Clem Barrow, the fiddle player, fell ill in August, and Wallace organized the men of the town to bring in Clem's small harvest before it was lost. She was helping to stack wheat in Clem's barn when the thunderstorm came through without warning, the sky turning green-black in under 20 minutes and the rain coming down in sheets. Everyone ran for cover, and Annie found herself in the dry dark of the barn with Wallace and 6 other people, watching the lightning crack across the hills while the rain hammered the roof with the sound of 1,000 horses. In the chaos of everyone rushing inside, she had stumbled and Wallace had caught her arm, and now they stood close together just inside the barn doors, his hand still at her elbow, watching the storm. She became aware in stages of how close they were, of the warmth radiating from him, of the steadiness of his presence beside her. "I grew up terrified of storms," she said, which surprised her because she had not planned to say it. "What changed?" he said. "I decided the terror was not useful," she said. "I still feel it. I'm just not ruled by it." He turned to look at her then, and the lightning outside lit his face, and she saw something in it that made the breath catch in her throat. Something open and unguarded that he usually kept carefully arranged. "That is about the bravest thing I have ever heard," he said, and his voice was different from his usual voice, lower and more direct, and she understood that he was not talking entirely about storms. She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the rain. Her heart was doing something complex, and she did not yet know what to do with it. He did not let go of her arm until the rain let up. The trouble came in September, as trouble tends to come, without much warning and from a direction you were not watching. Gerald Fitch had been nursing his injured pride for 3 months, and he had found, as small-minded men often do, a way to make someone else pay for it. He went to see Mr. Alderman, who owned the building that housed Doc Harrell's surgery, and he raised the rent by an amount that Doc Harrell could not pay and Annie could not make up for him. It was not clearly malicious on the surface. It was just business, and Fitch had enough money and enough influence in Redemption Creek to make it stick. Doc Harrell told her on a Thursday afternoon, standing in the middle of his records room looking more tired than she had ever seen him. "I am going to have to let you go," he said, and he looked genuinely pained about it. "And I am going to have to find smaller premises." "How long do we have?" she said. "End of the month." She sat with that for the evening. She considered her options, which were not plentiful. She could try to find other work in Redemption Creek, but it was a small town and positions were limited. She could move on to a larger town, San Antonio perhaps, where there would be more opportunities. She thought of Wallace and felt a sharp, specific reluctance that told her more about where she had arrived emotionally than any amount of quiet watching had done. She saw Wallace the next morning. He came to town for supplies and found her sitting on the surgery steps in the early light, drinking coffee and looking at the street with an expression that he apparently read correctly, because he sat down beside her without being asked and said, "What happened?" she told him. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. "Fitch," he said when she was done. The word was quiet and flat and held a great deal in it. "I cannot prove it," she said. "And even if I could, it does not change the practical problem." "What are you thinking of doing?" She looked at him. "I am thinking of several things. One of them involves leaving." She watched his face when she said it and saw something move in it, a tightening, a sudden alertness. "I would rather you did not do that," he said. It was direct and simple and very much like him. She felt the warmth of it move through her. "You would rather," she said. "Yes." He was looking at her steadily. "I would rather very much." The street was empty at this hour, the sun just climbing above the eastern edge of town, and they sat there on the steps in the new light with the silence of 2 people who have arrived at something significant. "I need a reason to stay," she said. "A practical one, something that makes sense." He took a breath. He turned his hat over in his hands once. "I have a ranch that needs someone who can keep accounts and order supplies intelligently," he said. I have been doing it badly for 3 years. It needs doing properly. I can offer fair wages and the use of the small house on the north edge of the property that currently has nothing in it but mice and an old iron stove." She looked at him. "That is a very practical offer. I intended it to be." "Is it only practical?" He met her eyes. In all the weeks she had known him, in all the careful, measured space he had kept, he had never looked at her quite so directly. "No," he said, "it is not only practical." She took a long breath of the morning air. She looked at the street, at the sun on the bleached wood of the buildings, at the way the light was turning the dusk golden. She thought about Georgia and Missouri and what it meant when a door opened. "I will need to see the small house first," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Of course." The small house on the north edge of the Dawson property was indeed full of mice, but it had good bones, as Wallace apologized, and the iron stove was sound, and the windows were large and faced in every useful direction. She stood in the middle of the main room on bare boards and looked around while Wallace stood in the doorway looking carefully at anything except her face. "I can make this work," she said. "Yes," he said. "I thought you could." She turned and looked at him in the doorway, silhouetted against the Texas sky. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I am not coming here to be Fitch's consolation prize or to give the town something to talk about or because I have no other options. I know that. I am coming because I choose to." He looked at her with that open, careful attention. "That is the only reason I want you to come." She moved into the small house on the 1st of October. She cleaned it from foundation to rafters, replaced the broken window panes with glass that Wallace had ordered from San Antonio, painted the interior walls a pale cream using paint she had found in the supply shed, and arranged her small collection of belongings with the satisfaction of a person arranging things that are finally, genuinely her own. She began working in earnest on the ranch accounts, and discovered in short order that Wallace had been significantly underpaying himself on paper, due to an accounting error he had been carrying forward for 2 years, and that his supplier in Abilene had been overcharging him on feed by an amount that, over 3 years, amounted to nearly $100. She wrote 2 letters that same day, and felt the particular satisfaction of a competent person operating in a domain where they are actually competent. She showed Wallace the numbers that evening at the kitchen table in the main ranch house, which was a large, spare, well-made structure that looked like the man who had built it, functional and without ornamentation but fundamentally sound. He looked at the corrected ledger and then at her for a long moment. "How long did this take you?" he said. 2 days. He shook his head slowly. "I have been bleeding money for years." "Not anymore," she said. He looked at her across the table with something in his expression that had moved well past simple appreciation, and he seemed to know it, because he looked back down at the ledger and cleared his throat. She gathered her papers and said good night and walked the quarter-mile back to the small house in the clear, cold October dark, and she stood outside her door for a moment looking up at the stars, which were vast and unhurried, and she thought that she had never in her life been in exactly the right place until now. The days found their rhythm. She rode out with him when he checked the cattle, learning the land, learning which creek beds were reliable in dry spells, and which hills offered the best wind shelter in winter. She learned the names of his hands, Rodrigo, who had come up from Chihuahua and was the best horseman she had ever seen, and Samuel, who was quiet and steady and had a gift for reading weather, and young Thomas, who was 17 and trying hard to be older, and who reminded her sometimes of a puppy that has grown into its feet but not yet into its dignity. She liked them all. They were careful with her at first, watching to understand what she was, whether a new boss or a temporary curiosity, but she found that if you were straightforward with people and neither condescending nor seeking their approval, they generally settled into a comfortable understanding fairly quickly. By the 2nd week she was eating supper with them, and by the 3rd she was arguing good-naturedly with Rodrigo about the best route to the south pasture. Wallace watched all of this with a warmth that he made only marginal effort to conceal. In late October, a cattle buyer named Devereaux came through from Fort Worth. He was a large man with expensive clothes and a manner that suggested he had decided ahead of time that he was the most important person in any room he entered. He came to the ranch and made an offer on 20 head that was insultingly low, and Wallace declined politely, which appeared to confuse Devereaux, who then made some comment about the wisdom of a man's business being managed by a woman in a way that was just ambiguous enough to allow him to pretend it was a joke. Annie, who was sitting at the desk in the corner of the main room with the ranch ledger, looked up from her papers. "Mr. Devereaux," she said, "the current going rate in San Antonio for cattle of this quality is approximately $4 above what you have offered. If you are unable to match that rate, I can recommend 3 other buyers who have expressed interest in this herd, and I would be happy to write you a letter of introduction to them." Devereaux stared at her. He looked at Wallace. Wallace's expression was completely neutral. "5 minutes," Devereaux said. "I need 5 minutes outside." He came back in 6 minutes and agreed to a price that was, in fact, $3 above his original offer, which Annie accepted on behalf of the ranch with the smooth efficiency of someone who has been waiting for this outcome all along. After Devereaux rode away, Wallace leaned in the doorway of the office and looked at her. "Where did you learn to negotiate like that? Running a general store in a town full of people who thought a woman would take whatever they offered," she said, without looking up from the ledger. "You learn quickly." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him cross the room and stop close to her, and then she felt the warmth of his hand very briefly on her shoulder. It lasted no longer than a second, and then he was gone, back out to the yard, and she sat perfectly still for a moment with the touch of it resonating through her like a note struck on a bell. The night he finally said it out loud, they were sitting on the porch of the main house after supper, as they had fallen into the habit of doing, watching the darkness come in over the hills. The air was cold in a way that felt good, clean and sharp after the long heat of summer, and somewhere out in the dark coyotes were talking to each other in that lonesome and musical way they had. He had been quiet for a while, longer than usual, and she had been content with the quiet, which was one of the things she had discovered about herself since coming to Texas, that she was capable of a kind of peace she had not known she was missing. "Annie," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at his hands. He was a man who was comfortable with silence and comfortable with action, but this particular variety of articulation appeared to cost him something. "I have been trying to think of the right way to say this for about 3 months, he said. She waited. "I am not a man who is good at this," he said. "I can tell you everything I know about cattle and rangeland and reading weather, but this," he stopped. He started again. "You have changed the way this place feels to me. And the way I feel. And I would be a fool if I let that sit here quietly and never said anything about it." She looked at him in the dark. Her heart was a full, complicated thing. "I love you," he said simply. "That is what it is. I know that is not a small thing to say, and I am not saying it as a small thing." She had known it was coming, in the way you know a storm before you can name the signs, and she had known what her own answer would be, had known it perhaps since the barn in the rain, or perhaps since that first morning when he had offered her his canteen on a dusty road and looked at her without expectation. But hearing it said out loud in his quiet, direct voice was still something entirely new, something that moved through her with the weight and warmth of a season changing. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some time." He looked at her, and she saw on his face something she had not seen before, a pure and unguarded joy that was so different from his usual careful composure that it made her breath catch. He reached out and took her hand in both of his, and they sat like that in the cold, dark quiet with the coyotes singing in the distance and the stars overhead and the whole enormous country around them. He kissed her that night, standing at the door of the small house when he walked her back in the dark, a kiss that was tentative at first and then not tentative at all. And she thought that this was what it was supposed to feel like. this complete and certain rightness. The winter was cold and hard and entirely beautiful. The prairie was dusted with snow that sparkled in the low sun, and the nights were brilliant with cold, sharpened stars. She moved through the days of it with a contentment she kept discovering in new places, in the warmth of the ranch house kitchen, in the satisfaction of the accounts balanced, and the supplies ordered correctly, in the sound of Wallace's voice calling to his hands across the yard, and in the particular way he looked at her across any room, as though he was quietly aware of the specific coordinates of her location at all times. They talked about the future with a comfortable directness. He asked her to marry him in December, standing in the kitchen of the main house with snow falling outside and a pot of coffee between them, and it was so thoroughly in keeping with his manner, plain and honest and without performance, that she said yes before he had quite finished asking, and then they both laughed about it. The wedding was in January, performed by Pastor Whitfield in the white church at the north end of Main Street. The whole of Redemption Creek came, which meant nearly everyone Annie knew in the world at this point: Doc Harrell, who cried unabashedly into a large handkerchief, Rodrigo and Samuel and Thomas, who were cleaned up to a degree she had not previously thought possible, old Clem Barrow, who played beautifully with his three-fingered hand, Mrs. Caldwell, who brought 3 pies, and an assortment of ranchers and townspeople who had watched this particular story developing for months, with the general satisfaction of people who like a good ending. Wallace's younger sister, Clara, had come up from San Antonio, a bright, dark-haired young woman of 20 who took one look at Annie and grabbed her hand and said, "Thank God. I have been waiting for this for 2 years." Annie liked her immediately. Wallace stood at the front of the church in a dark coat and a clean shirt, and watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of such complete and honest emotion that Annie felt her own eyes sting, and told herself firmly that she was not going to cry in front of 300 people. She managed it mostly. When Pastor Whitfield said the words that made them husband and wife, Wallace took both her hands and looked at her with that open, particular gaze and said, very quietly, "I will spend my life earning this." She pressed his hands. "So will I," she said. There was a celebration afterward in the saloon, which Mrs. Harmon had decorated with winter greenery, and which contained a great deal of excellent whiskey and Clem Barrow playing until midnight. Annie danced with her husband and thought that she had never used that word before, not in a way that meant something to her, and that she could get used to it very quickly. The spring that followed their marriage was the kind of spring that made you understand why people came to this country, green and vast and smelling of possibility. The cattle operation expanded. With the accounts now properly managed and the suppliers properly negotiated, Wallace had the capital to buy 15 more head and to hire a 4th hand, a quiet young man named Eli who had come west from Tennessee and who was as good with horses as Rodrigo was. Annie took on the management of the supply ordering for 2 other ranches in the area, which provided additional income and kept her mind engaged in the way it needed to be. The small house on the north edge of the property became her office. She had put bookshelves in it and a proper desk and 2 good chairs, and on Tuesday afternoons she kept what she called office hours, which meant that the ranchers and their wives who needed accounts work or correspondence or legal document reading could come to her with their problems, and she would solve them for a reasonable fee. It was a practical arrangement that filled a genuine need in the community, and it became quietly important to a number of people in Redemption Creek in ways she had not anticipated. She helped the Romero family understand that the deed to their property had been incorrectly recorded and connected them with a lawyer in San Antonio who corrected it, which saved them from a land dispute they had been losing for 2 years. She helped Thomas, the young ranch hand, write a letter to his mother in Memphis that was honest and affectionate, and which, he told her later with a sort of awe, was the first letter he had ever written that said what he actually meant. She helped Mrs. Caldwell, who had been running her eating house without a formal business arrangement for 12 years, set up her accounts in a way that would allow her to eventually own the building she worked in. These were not dramatic things, but they were things that mattered, and she had come to believe, in the thoughtful and practical way she believed most things, that the things that matter are usually not dramatic. Gerald Fitch left Redemption Creek in late April, moving his operation to somewhere further west. There was no ceremony around his departure. He had not been popular, and his going was noted with the same mild relief one notes the passing of uncomfortable weather. Wallace told her about it without particular emphasis, and she received the news with the equanimity of someone who had stopped caring about the matter some time ago. Summer brought heat and long days, and a particular incident that would become one of the stories they told about that time in their lives. A creek on the south edge of the property flooded without warning after a cloudburst in the hills, and the cattle in the south pasture had to be moved quickly. Annie rode out with the hands because there was not enough time to wait for another rider, and she spent 4 hours in the rain moving cattle across muddy ground with a competence that surprised everyone except, she noticed with some satisfaction, Rodrigo, who had apparently decided very early on that she was not a woman who needed to be surprised by. Wallace, riding back in the dusk with mud to his elbows and his hat dripping, looked at her across the yard and shook his head slowly. "You know," he said, "when I asked you to take the accounts job, I did not specifically plan for this." "I know," she said, "but here we are." He grinned at her, wide and unguarded, and she thought again that this expression on his face was still one of the finest things she had seen. In August she realized she was expecting their first child. She told Wallace on a Thursday evening, the same evening she had told him 4 other things about the ranch accounts, and she watched the information travel through him with a particular fascination. The way his face went still, and then opened into something so large and pure that it simply replaced everything else. He stood up from the table and crossed to where she was sitting and went down on one knee in front of her in a way that was entirely unself-conscious, and took her face in his hands carefully as though she were something precious. "Are you well?" he said. "Yes," she said, "completely well." "You are happy." She covered his hands with her own. "Wallace," she said. "Yes." He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that for a moment, and she felt the realness of it, the specific and irreducible weight of their life together, and was grateful for it with every part of herself. He told the hands the next morning at breakfast, and Thomas, who was now 18 and had developed in the past year into something much closer to the man he was going to be, sat back in his chair and said, "Well, that is about the best news I have heard since I got here," and then went red to the ears when everyone looked at him. The pregnancy was not without its difficulties. The summer heat was brutal, and she was tired in a way she had not expected, a deep bone-level exhaustion that required her to sit down at intervals, and which she found profoundly inconvenient given that she had work to do. Doc Harrell, who was managing her care with the combination of genuine medical knowledge and considerable personal anxiety, told her sternly twice a week that she was doing too much. She told him twice a week that she was doing exactly the right amount and that he should focus on his other patients. Wallace was attentive to a degree she occasionally had to negotiate with. He had, she discovered, a tendency under stress to become very still and very watchful, like an animal listening for something, and during the hard months of the pregnancy, this manifested as a particular quality of alertness in his presence, a constant low-level monitoring of her well-being that was entirely loving and occasionally a little much. "I am not made of glass," she told him one afternoon in September, when he had come in from the yard to check on her for the 3rd time in 2 hours. "I know that," he said. "Then please go back to whatever you were doing." He looked at her for a moment. "The feed order," he said, "which I already placed correctly this morning." He smiled slightly. Right, he stood where he was. "Wallace." "Yes, go," he went. She heard him laugh quietly on the other side of the door, and she turned back to her desk and allowed herself to smile at the wall. Their son was born in January of 1876, which struck Annie as a fine time to be born, at the beginning of a new year, and with the country in the middle of the centennial of its founding, though the centennial itself would not be celebrated until July, and she was not certain the baby would find this as historically significant as she did. The birth was attended by Doc Harrell and by Clara, who had moved to Redemption Creek the previous autumn, which Annie considered to be one of the better developments of that year. Clara had come for a visit and stayed because she had decided that Redemption Creek suited her better than San Antonio, and because, if Annie was being accurate, she was keeping an eye on the young Thomas, who had been transformed from an uncertain boy into a capable and decent young man, and who had been quietly devoted to Clara since the moment he met her, at a Christmas supper, where he had knocked a bowl of gravy off the table in the process of trying to hold a door open for her. The labor was long and the winter night was cold, and the oil lamps threw warm circles of light on the walls of the bedroom, while the ranch house made its nighttime sounds around them. Wallace was permitted into the room after the birth, which Doc Harrell had been somewhat ambivalent about but which Annie had made unambiguously clear was not optional. He came in quietly and stopped just inside the door, and Annie looked at him from the bed with the baby in her arms, and his face was doing something she had no adequate description for. She thought it might be the same thing she was feeling, which was a love so large it had changed the interior dimensions of everything. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time. His hands, those careful, capable hands, were so steady. "William," she said. They had agreed on the name in October, William James Dawson, the James for her father. "Hello, William," Wallace said to the baby, and his voice was so soft and so private that she felt she was witnessing something not meant for anyone else's ears, and loved him more for it than she had the day before, which she would not have thought possible. The years that followed were full ones. William James Dawson proved to be, from his earliest days, a person of strong opinions and considerable energy, which his mother considered a feature rather than a problem. He could walk by 10 months and talk in full sentences by 18, a development which Rodrigo observed was going to cause significant trouble for everyone, and which proved to be accurate. The ranch grew. By 1877, the Dawson operation was running nearly 100 head of cattle, as Wallace had once envisioned, and the accounts that Annie kept were the envy of several neighboring ranchers who came to her for advice on their own records. She expanded her Tuesday office hours to 3 days a week and hired a girl named Pearl, the 16-year-old daughter of a farmer named Matthews, to help with the copying work. Pearl was sharp and willing and learned fast, and Annie found, somewhat to her surprise, that she had a taste for teaching that she had not previously known about. She talked to Doc Harrell about it one afternoon, and he said, without looking up from his records, "You have been teaching since the day you arrived." You just did not call it that. She thought about that. She thought about the things she had not had access to as a girl in Missouri, the education she had assembled for herself through her father's almanacs and borrowed books and sheer stubbornness. She thought about Pearl, who was as capable as anyone she had met, and who had the additional disadvantage of being a girl in a country that did not always care about that. She began, in 1878, a small school that met 3 mornings a week in her office building. It was not an official school exactly, because there was no mechanism for official approval of such a thing, but it was a place where children and some adults who had not had the opportunity could come and learn to read and write and do arithmetic. She taught there herself and enlisted Clara, who turned out to have a genuine gift for it, and eventually old Doc Harrell, who taught basic medical facts and hygiene with the same blend of precision and drama that characterized his medical practice. It became, over time, one of the things Redemption Creek was known for in the surrounding country. People sent their children from ranches 20 miles away to spend a week at a time in town and learn. Annie handled this all with her customary practicality and without any particular sense of grandeur about it. It was a thing that needed doing. She was in a position to do it. She did it. She and Wallace talked about all of it, everything, the ranch and the school and the politics of the county and the books she was reading and the accounts and the people they knew. They argued sometimes, the way two people with strong opinions and mutual respect argue, directly and without malice, and usually to some productive conclusion. He was, she had discovered, as good at being wrong as he was at being right, which was a rarer quality than most people supposed. She watched him with William and felt each time a fresh wave of the same love, the way he had infinite patience for the child's endless why, the way he could explain the workings of a well pump or the feeding habits of cattle, or the names of constellations in the same steady, interested voice, as though the questions were all equally valid and all equally worth answering. In the spring of 1879, Clara and Thomas were married in the same white church where Annie and Wallace had been married, and it was a quieter ceremony than theirs had been, but no less genuine. Thomas was 20 by then, steady and kind, and so obviously in love with Clara that it was simply pleasant to be around them. Annie stood next to Wallace during the ceremony, and he took her hand with the naturalness of long habit, and she thought that this was the particular and irreplaceable beauty of a life shared with someone who had become, over time, as natural to you as breathing. William James was 3.5 and wore a small coat that matched his father's, and spent the reception very seriously attempting to teach old Clem Barrow the words to a song he had made up about cattle, with limited success. That autumn, Annie knew she was expecting again. She told Wallace on a Friday evening, and this time he was less silent than the first time, reaching across the table and squeezing her hand with a grin that was all warmth. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Capable," she said. "I have no doubt." The second child was a girl, born in the early summer of 1880, and they named her Ruth after Wallace's mother. She was born in the morning, which Annie considered to be a significantly more civilized hour than the middle of the night, and she arrived with the unhurried competence of a person who had decided to be here and had made arrangements accordingly. Wallace held Ruth with the same careful attention he had held William, and looked at Annie over her head with an expression that had been accumulating depth and meaning for 6 years, and that she recognized now as her favorite sight in the world. "Hello, Ruth," he said softly. William, who had been brought in by Rodrigo and was examining the proceedings with the intense scrutiny of a person encountering a rival, looked at his sister for a long moment and then said, "She is quite small." He considered this. "We should keep her." Wallace and Annie looked at each other. "Yes," Wallace said with complete gravity, "I think we should." Redemption Creek by 1880, one was a town of nearly 500 people, larger and louder and more complicated than the bleached little settlement Annie had stepped off a stagecoach into 7 years earlier, and she had watched its growth with the interested attention of someone who has a stake in a place. There was a new general store, bigger than the old one, and a real hotel, and the church had been expanded and painted, and the saloon had a new sign that did not say anything about ladies behaving. The school that Annie had started in her office had grown enough that the town had built a proper schoolhouse and hired a teacher, a young woman from Philadelphia named Miss Graves, and Annie served on the small committee that oversaw its running. Doc Harrell had retired from medical practice the previous year, his eyes no longer quite adequate for the close work, and the new doctor was a young man named Webb who had studied in St. Louis and who was, Annie thought, excellent at medicine and somewhat less excellent at the management of a practice, a situation she helped him with on an informal basis, because she knew from long experience that medical practices did not run themselves. Wallace had his 100 head of cattle and was considering a second 100. The ranch had 3 permanent hands and sometimes 4, Rodrigo now the foreman in everything but name, Samuel with his weather sense and his steadiness, Eli who had stayed and developed into an indispensable presence, and a rotating set of seasonal workers who came through on the cattle drives that crossed the property. She sat with Wallace on the porch of the main house one evening in the late September of that year, with Ruth asleep inside and William doing his reading at the kitchen table under the eye of Clara, who was 5 months along with her first child, and had the particular serenity of a person who has decided exactly what she wants from life and has it. The evening was warm, and the last light was going over the western hills in long gold and copper ribbons. "I was thinking about something," Wallace said. "Tell me." "That first morning, when I gave you water on the road to Fitch's ranch," she smiled. "I remember. I thought then that you were the most self-possessed person I had ever seen," he said. "Walking down a dirt road in the heat going to give back a ring to a man you barely knew because he asked to examine your teeth. It seemed like the reasonable thing to do," she said. "Most people's reasonable does not look like that." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that I think about that morning sometimes. The particular," he stopped. He started again, carefully. "The particular luck of it. That you stepped off that coach, and I happened to be standing there." She looked at him in the last of the evening light, this man she had chosen and who had chosen her, with whom she had built something solid and living out of red Texas dirt and hard work, and the particular stubbornness of two people who knew what they wanted and were not afraid of the work it took. "I think about it too," she said. He took her hand. They sat in the quiet as the stars came out one by one over the dark hills, and the coyotes began their nighttime conversation, and somewhere inside the house, Ruth made a small sound in her sleep and then was quiet again. William appeared in the doorway behind them, his reading finished, his dark hair disheveled in a way that was entirely characteristic. He was 7 now and large for his age, and had the Dawson jaw and the Morgan stubbornness, and the particular combination of the two that made him, his parents agreed, a person the world was going to find entirely impossible to ignore. "Mama," he said, "I finished my pages. All of them." "Yes," a pause. "There was one hard word." "What was the word?" "Consequences," he said. "Do you understand what it means?" He thought about it. "When something you do makes other things happen," he said, "good or bad." "That is exactly right," she said. "Well done." He considered this with satisfaction and then looked at his father. "Papa, can we check the horses before bed?" "Put your shoes on and come back out," Wallace said. William disappeared back inside. Wallace looked at Annie with a small, private smile. "Consequences," he said quietly. She squeezed his hand. "Good ones," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a gentleness that had never become routine, not in 7 years. "The best ones," he said. William came back out, shoes on and laces tied, and Wallace stood and put his hat on and took his son's hand and walked him down to the barn in the dark while Annie sat on the porch and listened to their voices, Wallace's low and patient, William's bright with questions, fading pleasantly into the evening. She heard Ruth make another small sound, awake now, and she rose and went inside to get her daughter, lifting her from the cradle with practiced ease and carrying her to the window where the last of the light still hung. Ruth looked up at her with dark, serious eyes, and Annie bent and kissed her forehead and thought, This is the door that opened. This is what was on the other side." Clara and Thomas had a son that December, a healthy and vocal boy they named James, and the families spent Christmas together in the ranch house with enough noise and warmth and food for twice their number. Old Doc Harrell came, and Rodrigo, and Eli, and old Clem Barrow, who played carols by the fire in the particular way that only he could and wept cheerfully at each one. Annie stood in the kitchen doorway watching Wallace hold James in the same arms that had held William, and then Ruth, watching him say something quiet to the baby with the same private tenderness, and she felt the fullness of the years all at once, not as a weight but as a richness, the specific accumulated beauty of a life that had been built carefully and truly. He caught her looking. He smiled across the room, that full and unguarded smile that she had seen for the first time in a barn in the rain and never tired of seeing. She smiled back. She went in to join them. The land around Redemption Creek grew and changed with the years. As land in the West was changing everywhere in those decades after the war, the cattle drives becoming longer, and the railroads pushing further into the territory, and the towns growing from collections of rough buildings into something more settled and permanent. Annie watched these changes with the attentive interest of someone who had arrived here as part of the change, and now had enough years in the place to have a stake in what it became. She had opinions about the railroads, about the land grants, and the way they sometimes displaced people who had been on the land for generations, about the cattle barons who were growing powerful enough in the territory to bend the law toward their own interests. She wrote letters about these things, to the county seat, to the territorial newspaper, to her senator, because she had discovered at some point in her years in Redemption Creek that she was a person who wrote letters, and that some of them made some difference, and that this was enough reason to write more of them. Wallace read her letters before she sent them and occasionally suggested that the phrasing was perhaps more direct than strictly required, and she occasionally agreed and occasionally didn't, and either way she sent them. He was proud of her for it. She knew this not because he said it in those words, which was not his style, but because of the way he talked about it to other people, the particular quality of pride that is too genuine for performance. The school grew. By 1882, there were 40 children enrolled, and Miss Graves had a deputy teacher, a young man named Reardon who had studied in Austin and who was quietly excellent at mathematics and less excellent at classroom authority, which Miss Graves made up for with an air of absolute expectation. Annie attended the committee meetings and occasionally taught at the school herself when the schedule required it, and she never stopped finding it one of the more satisfying things she did with her time. She had been in Redemption Creek for a decade when she allowed herself, one quiet morning in the office while the accounts lay open and the autumn sun came through the east window, to take stock of the distance traveled. She had come to this place as a stranger with $11.40 and no plan beyond the refusal to be treated like livestock. She had found her way through a combination of luck and stubbornness, and one man's honest face in the doorway of a general store. She had built a life, truly built it, with her hands and her mind and her love and the partnership of a man who had met her as an equal from the first morning and never stopped. She thought about her father, who would have liked Wallace, she thought, and who would have been bemused and pleased by Texas. She thought about the store in Missouri, the smell of it, sawdust and kerosene and dried beans, and felt no particular grief for the life she had not lived, only gratitude for the one she had. She thought about Gerald Fitch, briefly and without malice, as one thinks about a footnote. She thought about William, who was 9 now and learning to ride with a natural ease that impressed even Rodrigo, who was not easily impressed, and who had discovered in the past year that he loved stories with a passion that his mother recognized immediately. She thought about Ruth, who was 2.5 and had reached the stage of development that Wallace called the age of the firm opinion, which Annie considered accurate, and who had recently declared with absolute conviction that she preferred to wear her shoes on the wrong feet, and had stuck to this position with a fortitude that suggested she would be a force to be reckoned with. She heard Wallace come in from the yard, heard him stop in the doorway of the office, heard the pause that meant he was looking at her the way he did when he thought she was unaware. "I know you are there," she said, without turning around. "I know you do," he said. She turned. He was leaning in the doorway with his hat in his hand and the autumn sun behind him, and he looked, she thought, exactly like himself, which was the best thing he could possibly look like. "Come in," she said. "I want to show you the numbers for the quarter." He came in and sat across from her, and she spread the ledger between them and they bent their heads together over the columns of figures, their hands occasionally touching on the page, comfortable and easy and very much at home, in this office that had started as a room full of mice, in this ranch that had started as an idea, in this life that had started on a dusty road with a canteen of cool water and a man who looked at her without expectation. Outside, William's voice rose in the yard calling to Rodrigo about something, and Ruth's answering babble followed a moment later from somewhere near the kitchen. And the autumn air came in through the open window, smelling of dry grass and horses and the turned earth of the kitchen garden. And Wallace reached across the ledger and took Annie's hand and held it simply, the way he held it every day, with the unhurried permanence of a man who understood what he had and was not going to let the ordinary beauty of it pass unremarked. She looked at him, he looked at her. The sun moved through the window and lay warm across the desk and the open pages and their joined hands. "Good numbers," he said. "Very good numbers," she said. "Good," he said. And it was.